Mike Bloomberg started as a middle-class kid who had to work his way through college, then built a business from a single room to a global entity, creating tens of thousands of good-paying jobs along the way. He could have stopped there. But when New York suffered the terrible tragedy of 9/11, he took charge, becoming a 3-term mayor who brought a city back from the ashes. But now he sees a different kind of menace coming from Washington, so there's no stopping here. Because there's an America waiting to be rebuilt. Mike Bloomberg for president, jobs creator, leader, problem solver. It's going to take all three to build back a country.
Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, as you just saw there, officially has entered the 2020 presidential race. He also made a $31 million ad buy for television commercials, which dwarfs the entire advertising budgets of rival campaigns. Here's how some of the other candidates reacted to Mayor Bloomberg getting in the race.
We do not believe that billionaires have the right to buy elections. That is why multi-billionaires like Mr. Bloomberg are not going to get very far in this election.
Elections should not be for sale, not to billionaires, not to corporate executives. We need to build a grassroots movement. That's how democracy is supposed to work.
Money will not win this election. Connecting with people will.
You know, listen, we got to get money out of politics. Let me just be honest with you. I mean, I got to raise a ton of money to be competitive. And, you know, there's some people who started this race with $10 million.
So, Adrian, Mayor Bloomberg, $31 million out of the gate. Other campaigns' eyes popped and said, we wish we had $31 million to spend. He's skipping ahead. He's not going to play in Iowa and New Hampshire. He's going right at it in Super Tuesday. What, if anything, does Mike Bloomberg, you know, he's polling at 1 or 2%, depending on the poll. What does he do to this race?
Well, that's left to be seen. I mean, he's running, first of all, a completely unconventional campaign, right? He's not playing in the first 4 states. He's playing completely in Super Tuesday. He's not going to be on the debate stage because he's not taking donations. And going forward, the DNC will make sure that the donor threshold continues to increase so that it becomes more of a challenge to get on that debate stage. So we have to assume that that's not going to be part of his plan. But look, he's got unlimited amounts of money. The question becomes, how does that play? Can he overcome the stereotype that some of the candidates and voters are already saying, which is, you know, this guy's trying to buy his way into the race? What is the case that he's going to make to the American people? Why should I be president other than these 17 people who have been running, you know, really since the spring, if not before? So that's what's going to be fascinating to see is, can he actually overcome, you know, the stereotype about having, you know, this billionaire from New York, you know, trying to buy his way in the election. We also have to keep in mind that he's had a very successful tenure post-mayor. I mean, he's used his philanthropy in such a positive way, gun control, climate change, a number of issues. So I assume that he'll be running on that platform, too. He's also got a really strong team behind him. Kevin Sheekey, Howard Wolfson, some of the best Democratic strategists that we have in the party. I'm confident that they have a plan going forward that is based on analytics, that is based on polling data, that is based on a number of reasons that make them think that there is a path to him winning this primary.
Rev, the case for Mayor Bloomberg is competence. And what he's saying is, I'm actually the guy President Trump pretended he was, which is a business leader who's run things, knows how to fix things, not beholden to anybody because of all the money I have, et cetera, et cetera. But there are a lot of Democrats, as you know, who are saying, that's great. We could use all that money you have, but you don't have to get in the race. You know, do these issue ads, go after the president from the outside, but don't take from the others.
I think that is exactly right. That's what they're saying. I think what he's saying, though, is that he thinks that, in my opinion, that there's going to be no clear winner after the first few early primaries, and therefore he can come in and sort of like the grown-up has shown up now, and let's put this together and defeat Donald Trump. And if, in fact, you have one win in Iowa, another in New Hampshire, another in South Carolina, Nevada, then he feels he can come in and dominate and show that he has a clear shot and that he is enough of a centrist to where he can do that. You have to remember, even in New York, where he and I tussled a lot, he was also one that could work with you on certain areas. So I certainly was part of leading the marches against him on stop and frisk, opposed it then, and finally saw him admit 13 years later we were right. But I'll never forget, he and I met with President Obama, and President Obama asked him and I and Newt Gingrich to tour the country about education. And Bloomberg put up the money for the tour, put up the funds to look into this. So he works in a way that is not going to be as easily targeted as the left or the right, particularly with black voters, because the right has never been right with blacks and the left has left us out. So we're open to an argument that makes sense. I don't know that Bloomberg is that argument, but I don't think people ought to just say that South Carolina blacks or any other blacks are just going to go lockstep when all sides have really abandoned a lot of the interests that our community is concerned about.
David, unlimited money is the wild card here. He can do whatever he wants. He's worth $52 billion, so the bank account is wide open for this race. But beyond that, what is the lane for the 77-year-old New York billionaire in this race?
Right. So I guess for everybody that is lamenting the crash and burn of the Howard Schultz campaign, we now have Michael Bloomberg, who is running as a sort of center-left independent, even though he's running in the Democratic primary. And look, I think in the Democratic primary, there is a market for somebody who is center-left liberal and not far-left progressive. And so it's not like there's no calling for that. I think the question for Bloomberg is, one, can you, even though we've thrown out convention so many times, can you win a primary, Democratic or Republican, by ignoring the early states? We have no evidence to suggest that you can show up on Super Tuesday, no matter how much money you have, and gain momentum, gain the sort of imagination of your party. And so that is going to be, I think, a very tall order, because people start winning in those early states. They attract voters. People commit. You show up on Super Tuesday, and all of those voters have watched what's gone on, and they start to form opinions based on that. I think that the second thing is Michael Bloomberg clearly is going to make an electability argument, whether he says it outright or not. But you have to ask, as a matter of cultural politics, not economic policy or national security policy, but on guns, on issues like marriage, on issues like abortion, can he compete with President Trump in the right states with the right voters enough to eat into his margins, particularly with white working class voters, so that he can do damage in Wisconsin, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania? And the Democrats, as well as they have been doing, have a lot of trouble right now in western Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, as we saw with the Marquette U poll, and even Michigan, and don't forget Florida. And if he cannot make that argument successfully, then you have to ask, other than the fact that he would be a competent leader, from a political perspective, what is the argument for Bloomberg?
You know, Susan Page, the argument for Bloomberg might lie in one paragraph in his announcement statement, and it's similar to what the former Vice President Joe Biden has been saying out on the campaign trail, when Bloomberg said in his statement that if Donald Trump is reelected, we might never be able to repair the damage that he's already done. And if you go out there, anecdotally, what you pick up, I'm sorry to upset a lot of people at home, impeachment isn't the issue. Basically, the issue that is driving this thing right now in the middle stages of the presidential campaign seems to be, hey, fix the roads, would you? For God's sakes, do something about health care. You know, do something about prescription drug costs. So where do you think Mike Bloomberg stands in that parade of candidates, even with all of his money, in terms of, hey, fix the roads?
So maybe America's looking for a mayor, you're saying, somebody who deals with the problems in their daily lives, and certainly there's some history of that. I do think Bloomberg is trying to do something no one's done. I mean, Giuliani tried to do it, Jerry Brown tried to do it, to come in after the early contest and just get some momentum toward maybe a brokered convention. And by the way, I'm 100% in favor of a brokered convention, because I think that would be fun to cover.
Yeah.
But I do think Bloomberg has two big assets. One is $31 million this week, $31 million next week, $31 million the week after that for ads. But the other is, what is the thing that Democratic voters want most in a presidential candidate? And that is not ideological. It is an ability to defeat Donald Trump. So if he manages to do what you just suggested, if he manages to say to Americans, I'm the candidate who can defeat Donald Trump, at a time when there's some nervousness about Joe Biden, strength as a candidate, there's some nervousness about Elizabeth Warren and whether she is too far left for America. That is the rather narrow lane that I think Mike Bloomberg is trying to drive down.
Of course, there already is a mayor in the race, but he's the mayor of a city in Indiana of 100,000 people, and not the former mayor of New York City, which has 8.5 million. I do think that this is, we've seen the last 2015, 2016, we saw an election like any other. This is a new twist to this one. You know, we've never seen a candidate come in this late with have any kind of sort of success, and certainly we've never seen it's the money. It can't be overstated. It's $31 million dropping just today and this week, and it is going to be an onslaught. I mean, Tom Steyer is a billionaire. He has spent a lot of money. Bloomberg can dwarf what he did. And we will have to see if it's wall-to-wall coverage. Does he get diminishing returns? Do people start tuning out those ads? And can you run a presidential campaign simply by advertising? Michael Bloomberg is not good at one-on-one retail interactions. Neither was Donald Trump. But Trump was out there night after night with the rallies, and voters felt like they got to know him through the rallies. Bloomberg is going to need to be out there in some way for voters to get to know him and trust him. And it feels like a tall mountain to climb. But if anyone can do it with his money, it's him.
Adrian, as someone who ran against Bernie Sanders last time when he worked on the Hillary Clinton campaign, how do you think Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are feeling about Mike Bloomberg getting into the race, saying, here's another billionaire who wants to spend all his money and buy himself an election. This is exactly what we're running against, they'll say.
Well, I think they're enjoying it because they get to basically make the case as to why they're running, which is we are trying to get big money out of politics. We are trying to, focus on the people. And the two of those candidates in particular have raised a lot of money, significant amounts of money from small grassroots donors. So they get to go out there and basically say, not only are we raising money from a small army of small donor amounts, but we're also able to build this army of people who are going to support us and sustain us throughout this campaign, whereas Michael Bloomberg is not taking any donations from anybody, and he is essentially, using his own money to buy this election. So it's kind of playing right into their hands. But the question is, what do the voters want? Do they care about that? That's left to be seen.
Rev?
I think that we also should not ignore another new entry, and that's Deval Patrick, that could really make an impact in this sense. If Iowa goes either way, when you get to New Hampshire, you are looking at his backyard where he was governor as Elizabeth Warren was senator. If Deval Patrick comes in the top three in New Hampshire, it changes the race going into South Carolina, where you have a former black governor who proves some electability in New Hampshire. So as much as I agree that Liz Warren and Bernie Sanders may be happy to see Bloomberg come in because it gives them a good punching bag, they've got to be concerned about the Deval Patrick impact in New Hampshire that could upset both of their games going forward. That, if I were them, I'd be up at night looking at Patrick more than I would be celebrating Bloomberg as my punching bag.
Governor Patrick still has a big climb to get up into that top three, but he's got a little time here. Coming up next, former National Security Advisor John Bolton is back on Twitter claiming the White House locked him out of his account. The White House hitting back, saying Bolton's, quote, advanced age may be to blame. Morning Joe's back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.